Ladies and gentlemen, if we could take our seats. Go on, Shane, grab a seat. Well, ladies and gentlemen, now that I've asked you to take a seat, I'm going to ask you to stand for the Australian National Anthem. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please take your seats? And thank you to our organist, Jennifer Chu. My name's Gavin Collery, and I've had the honour of working for and with Sir Arvi for almost 30 years, and I'm your officiant for this commemoration, which is a celebration of life of Sir Arvi Parbo. If you have your mobile phones with you, would you please turn them to silent? Now, as we know, safety is important, so if you hear the well-practiced audio tones, Town Hall staff will appear and escort you via the green exit signs and doors to the assembly area. Ladies and gentlemen, there are many distinguished guests with us today, and there are simply too many to name, but I would wager that Sir Arvi would rate anyone and everyone in this room as distinguished guests, especially if you happen to be a mining engineer. However, I will single out one, and it's not a person, but it's a family. The Parbo family, led here today by Lady Sima and her 3 children in Alan, Peter and Martin, her 6 grandchildren and their extended family. So Lady Sima, our thoughts are with you and your family today and always. As you can see from the booklets containing the order of service, our first speaker is a friend to many and a respected friend to Sir Arvi, our 25th Australian Prime Minister, the Honourable John Howard OM AC. Would you please join us on stage, Mr Howard?
Thank you very much, Lady Sima Parbo, the other members of the Parbo family, many distinguished guests, but may I be forgiven for mentioning, of course, Australia's greatest living historian, Geoffrey Blaney, and Mr Hugh Morgan, who has played such a basic role in getting together this very appropriate commemoration of a remarkable life. If you were taking a stocktake of the Australian achievement to date, of all that this lovely country of ours has achieved and what it represents, amongst the many things that you would have to acknowledge are 2 to which Arvi Parbo was absolutely fundamental. The first of those, of course, is the integral part that the mining industry has played in the wealth and the prosperity and the development and the survival of the Australian nation and of the Australian economy. The mining industry has been so important to our nation, and we have been reminded in recent weeks of just how fundamentally important it is to the future well-being of our country. The other, of course, is the remarkable contribution that post-World War II migration has made to the Australian nation. In so many ways, Arvi Parbo was an exemplar of the triumph of post-World War II migration. He was a man, of course, who understood the privations of living under dictatorships, the shameful treatment of his native Estonia under the infamous secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and the way in which it was passed around as a piece almost of national disdain between the Russians and the Germans, bred in him and his family a deep distrust of totalitarian regimes and an embrace of the freedom of Australia. And one of the remarkable things, of course, about Arvi Parbo, not surprising perhaps it was not remarkable, but very surprising, unsurprising indeed, was that he never forgot what Australia meant to him as somebody who had survived totalitarianism. And as the story has it, he'd walked 300 miles to Germany to escape the privations of Russian rule on his native country. He never forgot that, and he never ceased to remind Australians of how fortunate we were. And those of us in this gathering, like myself, who were lucky to win the lottery of life and to be born in Australia, must understand just how thankfully a person such as Arvi Parbo embraced this country. Many of you in this gathering, of course, work with Arvi Parbo and know better than I did the extraordinary contribution he made to the mining industry. I treasure a number of personal anecdotes of my acquaintance and friendship with him. I remember as a very junior minister in the Fraser government in the middle to late 1970s when we had pre-budget consultations and industry leaders would gather in the old cabinet room and present arguments as to what might or might not be included in the upcoming budget. And Arvi Parbo struck me then as a person of quiet decency. He measured his words, and perhaps like many people whose second language is English rather than their first, his articulation of his thoughts and his command of the English language was absolutely remarkable. And I went away from those meetings thinking, there is a giant of a man. And of course, he was a giant of a man in the mining industry. When you think of the colossal contribution of Western mining, when you think of the nickel discoveries at Kambalda, you think of the fact that the first commercial iron ore exports from Western Australia to Japan were from Western mining. When you think of the great discoveries, of course, of Olympic Dam, and of course, Arvi would never cease quietly but effectively to remind governments of how some years ago, and I'm talking now 20, 30, 40 years ago, to put it in its context, it was much easier to get an approval. He one of those who wrote the obituaries for Arvi when he passed away, reminded us that in the 1960s it was a bare 18 months in relation to the Kambalda discovery between the first hole and the actual commercial exports. Compare that, of course, with the frustration of Olympic Dam, when years later you had to deal with 54 government departments and a period between the relevant stages of the development, of course, a period of some 13 or 14 years elapsed. I remember very clearly running into Arvi when I was treasurer way back in the late 1970s, and I was attending a conference in Germany. And Arvi and I bumped into each other, and we spent a very useful half hour or so talking about economic prospects in Australia. And of course, the Australia of those days was a far more regulated, less adventurous economy than it was ultimately become. And Arvi reminded me during that discussion of just how fundamentally important foreign investment would always be to the future of Australia. Years later, when I was Prime Minister, I recall going to, I think it may have been a fundraising function. I don't recall precisely what the purpose of the fundraiser was. I think it may have had something to do with politics, but I won't dwell on that. A fundraising function in Western Australia, and Arvi was seated next to me, and he very quietly said to me, "John, you've got to understand just how much time is needed to assemble the capital required for mining projects. And I fear that there is a danger in this country that we take for granted just how easy it is to extract ore from the ground because Providence has been so incredibly kind to us." We do take pause today to celebrate this remarkable life. He was, it's no exaggeration to say, a towering figure in the mining industry in this country. And when you think of the contribution that that industry has made, not only in an ongoing sense, but more recently, the strength and the importance of the mining industry did more to save Australia from the ill effects of the global downturn in the economy over the last decade than any other single factor. And when you place Arvi Parbo in the pantheon of that industry, when you acknowledge his leadership not only of Western mining, but his chairmanship of the big Australian and of the other companies that he chaired, and the ongoing advice and counsel that he provided to the mining industry, you look upon the life and a career of a very remarkable Australian. He lived a long and good life. He lived a life of great adventure, but also great adversity. He understood tyranny and he embraced freedom all the more because of his understanding of tyranny. And when you contemplate the beginnings of that life in rural Estonia and you trace it through its long contribution not only to his native Estonia but also to his adopted country Australia, a nation he embraced with passion and commitment all the years that he lived here, we take the opportunity to thank him for what he's done for our country. We honour the wonderful family that supported him through his life. And we also honour his working colleagues, so many who are here today. It is an industry that he gave leadership to. It's an industry that he didn't dominate in the literal sense of that word, but it's an industry that he inspired, and which is the true test of leadership. So on behalf, I hope, of many hundreds of thousands of Australians whose lives were touched by him, I count it as a real privilege to have been asked to speak at this gathering, to honour his life, and most particularly to think of what an exemplar he was of that great generation of what we used to call new Australians, who became such passionate and committed Australians, who came in their millions, first from Europe and then from other parts of the world. And very particularly, we remember the contribution of those who came from the Baltic countries, such as Estonia. They grabbed the opportunity of being in Australia. They grabbed the opportunity and they repaid their gratitude by contributing so much. And I can think of no greater exemplar of that great generation of post-World War II migrants who meant so much to this country than the man that we so thankfully honour today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is known to many of us as Australia's most eminent historian, but to Sir Arvi he was simply a good friend. Professor Geoffrey Blaney, AC. Professor Blaney, would you please join us on stage?
Lady Parbo, members of the family, honoured guests. I think I first met Arvi just before Easter 1961. I knew him slightly, but we were walking along Hannon Street in Kalgoorlie and we recognised each other. It was about 6 p.m. and we did what people did in Kalgoorlie at about 6 p.m. We went to the nearest pub. We then had a meal. John Howard has spoken eloquently about the importance of mining for Australia and about the distinctive contribution which Arvi Parbo made to mining in the last century and this. Part of my speech I will delete because John Howard has covered it so skillfully. I initially thought, from Arvi's appearance, that he might be a Russian. How wrong I was. He had no wish at all to be a Russian. He was an Estonian, and Russia was his country's traditional enemy. The Soviet Union had thwarted him and his family and his life. Accordingly, in the last phase of the Second World War, he escaped in that long procession of Baltic refugees which entered West Germany. Within a few years, as John Howard explained, he was in the same stream of Baltic refugees who were welcomed here. Of all the Estonians, Latvians and Lithuanians who arrived in this country, I think he contributed the most to his adopted land. You could say that he made his own way in the world. He first worked underground in a coal mine in Germany. He became very deaf in his last years, and this was attributed to the noise of the rock drills and the mining equipment in the mine in the Ruhr. In Australia, as a mining student, he had to earn his living while he worked. For a period, he was a conductor on the Adelaide trams. I feel sure that few travelled in his tram without a ticket. It was in Adelaide that he met his wonderful wife, Saima, who too was Estonian. Of his career in the mining industry, Hugh Morgan will say more. Speaking just as a historian of mining, I met Sir Arvi many times. His eye for the trivial detail was acute. In his eye, of course, no detail was trivial. An admirer of the prospectors and engineers and other pioneers of Australian mining fields, he wrote, with support from Gilbert Ralph, an illuminating history of each of the mining fields he visited when he was the president of the Australasian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy. He liked to find solutions. A solution meant bringing people together. He tried to bring them together, even if they did not stay together. He thought clearly. Often he saw very speedily what was the core of a problem. He possessed humanity and sympathy too. He valued men and women who did their daily job with skill. He praised them, no matter how humble was their job. He was really an encourager. In 1998, for 10 days, Arvi and I sat side by side, elbow to elbow, at the Constitutional Convention held in Canberra to resolve the question whether Australia should become a republic. On the third day, he whispered to me that the conference might well become more a jamboree for talking than for making decisions. He preferred action to prolonged talk. I should say that one day John Howard tapped us both on the shoulder and said, "Come and have a meal, a simple meal, in the Prime Minister's lodge." We had a wonderful evening, and Arvi said to me, it was worthwhile after all. He preferred to write a report of 1 page rather than 2 pages. He liked to be succinct. He was willing to be a follower, but he found himself so often a leader. An impressive chairman, he was invited to preside over many institutions outside the mining industry, whether the Business Council or the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences or various others. And yet he was not hungry for power and not hungry for wealth. He did not live in a fashionable suburb, but in one of the half-developed suburbs out towards the Dandenongs. He liked to have space around him and grass and trees. It is now forgotten that he believed in combining economic development with preserving, as far as possible, the environment. When he was chairman of Alcoa Australia in 1990, his company won United Nations awards for protecting the environment, and especially the Jarrah forests. One award was denounced one morning on ABC radio in the presence, I think, of Andrew Olley. Dr. Bob Brown was the denouncer, then the leader of the Green Movement in Australia. Bob Brown said that the award was a disgrace. Arvi Parbo promptly invited Brown to come and see for himself how the forest was being preserved or restored. Brown replied that it had already flown over these Kari forests. Arvi replied that Brown should have come down to earth because the forest was actually Jarrah. In his heyday, many people would recognise him as he walked down Collins Street in Melbourne and Hannon Street in Kalgoorlie and the Terrace in Perth. He was distinctive in build, manner, face, accent and outlook. I must conclude. What was Arvi's greatest talent? What was his greatest talent? I think it was common sense. A child of war-torn Europe, may he rest in peace.
Thank you, Professor Blaney. Ladies and gentlemen, Sir Arvi migrated to Australia in 1949, and as we well know, he retained a strong bond with Estonia, his country of birth. Would you please stand for the Estonian national anthem? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Would you please take a seat? I would now like to introduce Lembit Marda, the Honorary Consul of Estonia in Melbourne. Consul Marda, would you please join us on stage?
Lady Saima, Parbo family, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. So Arvi and my parents had a lot in common. They fled Estonia at the end of the war. They fled to Germany. They both left Europe in Italy and fled to Australia, and arriving in Australia in 1949, they also were at the Bonegilla migrant camp. So Arvi Parbo was always proud of his Estonian heritage, never forgetting where he came from. As a prominent individual and frequent traveller, he was able to speak compassionately of Estonia's history and its plight at a time when little was known about Estonia. After his retirement, Arvi published a booklet called On Estonia and Estonians, primarily for his children and grandchildren, as a guide to historical Estonia, the country, its land, and his own personal journey of growing up as a boy and eventually coming to Australia. I'd like to read to you extracts from this booklet as written by him in the first person. My parents had a dairy farm in the west of Estonia. I had 3 brothers, there were no sisters. My father did much of the work with some permanent but mostly seasonal hired help. My brothers and I helped from an early age, and we soon became skilled in all kinds of farm work, including handling horses. We were never told to work, but we were proud to do so. It never occurred to us to behave in any other way. Horse-drawn carts in the summer and sleds in the winter were the only means of transport, in addition to our bicycles and skis. We never owned a motor car or a truck. Sauna once a week was an essential part of our life. Virtually all the food was produced on the farm. Only items such as salt, sugar, and herrings were purchased. We salted pork, and bread was baked from our home, from our own rye. Mother would pickle cabbage and cucumbers, both favourite Estonian foods. Although a very modest drinker, Father would brew his own beer and make wine from cherries and other berries. The wooded part of the farm was ideal for playing cowboys and Indians. Another favourite game was soldiers. I was always the general, with 2 younger brothers as officers of a lesser rank. The only private in our army was a family dog who was ordered around by all of us. Education was highly valued. This came from tribal memory because for a long time, the only way for Estonians to improve their lot had been through education. My brothers and I attended the local primary school about 4 kilometres from the farm, riding our bicycles, skiing, or just walking. We would be taken by horse and cart or sled only if the weather was very bad. Apart from learning, the schools also instilled in us the spirit of patriotism and national pride. Virtually all the boys, including myself, belonged to an organisation called Young Eagles, modelled on Boy Scouts but with a particular Estonian flavour. Later, I attended the humanitarian secondary school and eventually transferred to the technical college to study electrical engineering in Tallinn. The winters were cold, and I do not recall a Christmas without snow. Once a year, Father and sometimes Mother would visit Tallinn. On return, he would invariably bring back a suitcase full of books to add to the already substantial library at home. When we were small enough, Father Christmas would arrive after dark, always after Father had left to attend some urgent tasks somewhere else. We would have to recite poems and answer questions about our conduct during the year before receiving presents. My father was a somewhat stern man with clear-cut values. Integrity and self-reliance were his hallmarks. He worked very hard and did not tolerate slackness or sloppiness in others. A stickler for punctuality, he transferred this habit to me. To this day, I cannot stand being late. People may conclude that we're underprivileged, an isolated life working long hours on a farm without electricity or a motor car, refrigerator or washing machine, mostly without a telephone and just a radio in the evenings for news and entertainment. But this was a normal lifestyle. on modest-sized farms in a country at that time. We were neither well off nor poor, but managed satisfactorily. Had anybody told us that we were lacking anything, we would have been surprised. I enjoyed my boyhood in the pleasant and peaceful Estonian countryside. Towards the end of the Second World War, many Estonians left the country ahead of the Red Army. Leaving meant abandoning homes, assets, careers, and often family members. I was away from my family at this time, and in the chaos and confusion, there was no opportunity for me to make contact and farewell my family. This decision was indeed traumatic. I was forced to make up my mind quickly and ended up in Germany. By the time my family decided to leave and reach the coast, there were no boats available to escape. They reluctantly returned home and continued to live on the farm. I was the only member of the family to leave Estonia, and for 3 years we had no contact. After 5 years as a refugee in Germany, I emigrated to Australia in 1949 and completed my studies in mining engineering that I had initially commenced in Germany. Choosing Australia was simple. I was in a hurry. The queue of applicants to go to Australia was shorter than for any other country, and it was the furthest away from war-torn Europe. During one of my trips to Estonia over the Christmas period of 1977, I had just been made a Knight Bachelor in the New Year's honours list. My family in Estonia was unsure what that meant. My mother asked if I now had a castle in England. Regrettably, I had to admit there was no such castle. On a visit to Tallinn in December '81 and on a walk, I caught my foot in corrugations in the ice and broke my right leg. I was eventually repatriated to Helsinki, and one of the first questions my American friends asked was, "Who will you sue?" It had never occurred to me to even think about it. I was brought up to accept responsibility for what I did and had simply forgotten to walk like a duck on icy ground. Leaving the extracts aside, I would now like to speak personally. In 1990, the Estonian Prime Minister invited a group of Estonians from abroad with Western and economic business experience, including Arvi, to advise him on the transition of the economy to a free market system. At a later date, the President of Estonia awarded him the Order of the White Star in recognition of his services rendered to the state. Arvi generously supported many Estonian causes in Australia, including patron of the 1988 Estonian World Festival in Melbourne, the Estonian Society in Melbourne, the Estonian festivals that alternated between capital cities, patron of the Estonian Relief Committee between 2005 and 2015, and the Serve Children's Summer Camp, to name just a few. The Estonian community in Australia has always been immensely proud of him and what he achieved. On behalf of the Council of Estonian Societies in Australia and the Estonian community at large, we are proud and honoured to call him our own. Thank you.
Thank you, Consul Marta. Now to family. Two of Sir Arvi's grandchildren will speak on behalf of their family, Kira McNeice and Rory McNeice. Would you please join us?
Distinguished guests and friends, on behalf of Arvi's family, thank you for being here today. It's humbling to see the profound impact Arvi had on so many people's lives and to see all of you here today to celebrate his life and acknowledge that impact. We'd like to thank those who've spoken before us for their very kind words in particular, for how well they have described the man who was Sir Arvi Parbo and the legacy that he left for us and for this country. But we are not going to speak about Sir Arvi Parbo. Instead, we would like to tell you a little about the man we knew as Babu. Babu is not, as many of you may be thinking, the Estonian word for grandfather. When Kira was about 5, she wanted to speak to Saima. Being clever, she went to the phone, dialed the number for our grandparents' house, which was no mean feat on one of those old rotary phones for a 5-year-old, and waited as the phone rang. As he always did, Arvi answered the phone. Parbo speaking. Kira, expecting Saima, was confused. "Hello, Babu," she said, having misheard Parbo. "I'd like to speak to my grandma." The name stuck, and to family, Arvi became Babu.
A few years ago, I was out to dinner with a group of people I didn't know very well. I can't remember how it came up, but at some point, someone mentioned who my grandfather was. The woman sitting opposite me, and I got the impression she wasn't the biggest fan of mining, she said to me, "Wow, what was that like, growing up with Arvi Parbo as your grandfather?" I wasn't really sure how to answer her. For one thing, I'd only ever known one grandfather. But as Rory said, we didn't really know Sir Arvi Parbo. We didn't work with him. We knew our grandfather Babu. The man who, when Saima cooked us egg cake for lunch, would stomp around and threaten to eat all of our lunch as the egg cake monster if we didn't finish it fast enough. The man who, if we were very good and very lucky, would let us ride around in the little trailer of his ride-on lawnmower. The man who, in his home office, alongside various awards and recognitions that he'd been honoured with, always kept a framed painting right above his desk. A painting Rory had done in prep, a 5-year-old's painting of a man with a shovel, captioned in his teacher's handwriting. "This is my grandfather Babu in a mine," it said. "He works for Western Mining." That said, in the last few weeks, as we've heard from so many of his colleagues about the sort of man that Arvi Parbo was, we've realised that he was very much the same man that we knew as Babu, and that a lot of who he was in his professional life was also reflected in his personal life with us. Babu was a man of straightforward, unhesitating solutions. His way of dealing with a chair with a wobbly arm was to drive 2 giant bolts straight through the wood to fix it in place. It might not have been the prettiest solution, but nobody could argue that it wasn't functional. And this way of fixing things in the most direct and practical way became known to the family and friends as Babufying things. I won't forget the time that he once saw me halfway up a tree, carefully putting not quite too much of my weight onto an obviously rotten branch to reach the next one. "That branch isn't safe," he declared, and, grabbing a nearby rake, walked over and knocked the branch clean off the tree. It was all well and good, but then I had to figure out how to get down without a branch to stand on. He was a man who never said something couldn't be done, but did always insist that any attempts were made in a sensible way. There was one day, not actually too long ago, when he came outside and saw Saima on the roof fixing tiles. She would have been about 80 at the time, and Babu quite reasonably demanded to know what the bloody hell she thought she was doing. "You'll break your neck," he said, and immediately drove down to Bunnings to buy a harness, which he fixed to the first floor so that she could continue to fix the tiles safely. He was a man who kept meticulous records of anything you might ever want to know or remember. Within minutes, he could rummage through his files, give you the number plate of every car he'd ever owned, or the time, date, and flight number of our mother Ellen's first trip to Japan in the 1970s. A few years ago, when a tree fell on his fence and it needed replacing, he looked up the company who had built it 50 years earlier. They were still operating, and he called them in to replace it. He prepared for every possible scenario. On the day that he died, when our Uncle Peter booted up his computer to find the contact details of our relatives in Estonia, there was a file on the desktop titled Funeral, detailing exactly what he wanted done after he'd passed. And he was a man who, even for those of us 2 generations removed from the war that he escaped, we could see had been profoundly impacted by his experiences of it. There was nothing he valued more than education. To quote him directly, "A good education is the best asset one can have. Among other things, you can always take it with you, whatever happens. Wars, earthquakes, tsunamis, or other disasters. Can't say this for most other assets." The greatest praise that he ever offered any of us was that we were worth feeding, which on the one hand was typical of his dry, understated attitude to most things in life. But on the other, I don't think any of us ever forgot that worth feeding meant worth the effort it had taken to put the food on the table, meant worth everything that Babu had gone through to establish and support his family in Australia, having arrived here with little more than a bit of knowledge about engineering and his wits.
Babu was a generous man with his time, his resources, and his advice. He was always there if we had something to talk about and would sit patiently listening. He was also known for responding to emails almost instantly, especially if it was asking for advice. Anytime you'd mention something, say you thought, there was a time when Casey, our youngest brother, said, "Oh, I quite like these Tim Tams." The next week when we went over for family lunch, there were 3 packets. There was also always a packet of mincemeat in the fridge, not for anyone to eat, but to make sure that the magpies outside were well fed when they came calling in the afternoon. With regard to his advice, there was only one time I can recall that Babu said he couldn't help, and that was with advice when I was looking for one of my first jobs. And he said, "I can't help you because I only ever applied for one job in my life." And the conversation took about 2 minutes. Despite all that Arvi had seen and done in his life, Babu was never above stepping in and doing the hard work. Everything that needed to be done around the home was done by him and with the help of our cousins, Hilla and Ashley. This became known as Babu work. Anything that needed doing, it was Babu work and it would get done. He would still cut the wood for the fireplace on Sundays, well into his 80s. Of course, he had a sense of humour about it. As age crept up and he found himself watching his grandchildren cutting the firewood instead, he would stand by and provide advice. "Cut it this way. That one's fine. Put it over there." Then there'd be a brief pause as he watched us work, followed by a dry, "This is what we call management." We all deeply valued Babu's insights and advice. He was a man who could say more in a sentence than most could in a paragraph, and he had a way of cutting straight to the heart of matters, as others have said, of understanding exactly what the point of contention or conflict was and addressing it directly. We didn't always agree. In fact, we spent many, many Sundays sitting around the fireplace after lunch and arguing about the state and future of the world. But that too was something Babu always encouraged: open debate, honest disagreement, and forming our own opinions. In recent years, I think that quite deservedly, Babu had reached the point in his life when he felt it was time to let the next generations get on with solving these sorts of problems. On more than one occasion, after a few hours of discussing politics, Babu would conclude by saying, "The world is going to be an awful mess, and someone will have lots to do. Fortunately for me, I won't be around too much longer." Sunday lunches, and our lives for that matter, are never going to be the same without him. There may now be an empty seat by that fireplace, but Babu will still be there in the educations we hold, which help us to understand the world around us. He'll still be there in the openness and respect that we see as fundamental to how we interact with other people. He'll be there as we look for practical and sensible solutions to problems, from world affairs to moving a pile of firewood from one end of the driveway to the other. And he'll be there in the sheer stubborn optimism he always demonstrated by example. To quote him one last time, "A number of times in my life, I thought the world was coming to an end, and it never did. The most important thing in life is to be at peace with yourself. Do the best you can, and don't worry about what others will think or how things could have turned out better." Babu titled his memoirs "Just Passing Through," which is exactly the sort of understatement he would make. But in passing through our lives, he has shaped and supported them in ways we will never forget. So to Sir Arvi Parbo, Babu, from all of us in the family, thank you. We are glad we got to be here as you pass through.
Thank you, Kira, and thank you, Rory. Ladies and gentlemen, Hugh Morgan AC has known Sir Arvi generationally. That's my way of saying for a very, very long time. Mr. Morgan, would you please join us on stage?
On behalf of all the friends and admirers of Sir Arvi Parbo, I join in welcoming you here to this memorial commemoration and to extend our condolences and best wishes to Sima, her children, Ellen, Peter, Martin, and extended family. Arvi died peacefully at home on the 1st of May, and was his wish he was cremated at a family funeral the following week. The gathering today is one of celebration for a man whose remarkable life and admiration by so many from all sectors of society is rare. An immigrant from a country destroyed in war rises to become a much-loved leading figure across the nation's mining industry, its senior business associations, its political leadership, educational institutions, and to become an industrial ambassador abroad as the appreciation of his standing and respect grew. Arvi's journey from his birthplace in Tallinn in 1926 has been well recorded, and I will not dwell on all the steps of his career since. Were I to do so, we would need to pause for an intermission and refreshments. However, I do need to paint a very short account of the timelines to place all of the appreciative comments made this morning. His early decisions reflected the logic he maintained throughout his life. He suffered under the yoke of the Russians, the destruction wrought by the Germans, and then took the logical decision to resolve the Germans were a better bet as a refugee than the Russians as he fled his homeland in 1944. In Germany, he managed to gain engineering qualifications, but again came to the conclusion that Germans were likely to employ German engineers to rebuild their country, not Estonian engineers. So he decided to emigrate. Why Australia, you might ask? And the response was because it had a shorter queue. All these steps in logic were faultless. What he probably overlooked was that upon arrival in Australia, his German qualifications were not recognized, as was the case for many non-UK or Australian qualifications at the time. He enrolled at Adelaide University in the engineering faculty, the faculty of so many great Australian mining identities, and graduated with honours in 1955, having also completed 2 years of compulsory sponsored employment. He recounts in his retirement speech how it was he became a WMC employee. I was engaged by Frank Espy Sr., who was the then Deputy Managing Director based in Kalgoorlie, and who was what you might call, in today's jargon, the company's Chief Operating Officer. He was passing through Adelaide when I was finishing my mining engineering course, and it was arranged that I would meet him for an interview. His plane was late, and he had another important appointment. We therefore finished up meeting at the corner of King William Street and North Terrace, and the interview took place while we walked to the location of his next meeting. "I understand you want to work with Western Mining," said Mr. Espy, to which I replied, "Yes." "Done," said he, and this is how I was employed by the company. WMC was a close-knit organisation, relied on respect in its working relationships, enjoyed hard work, and held strong suspicions of HR departments. This was a view long held by Arvi, notwithstanding the many thousands of extra personnel to join the company during his leadership. Well, he was not alone in that view. Advancement in the company was rapid, following his first commitment to the remote gold mining development in Western Australia. With Sima and their daughter Ellen, they travelled to Bullfinch, near Marvel Lock, to work in mine development. It was not long before his talent was noticed and sent to Melbourne to work for the then managing director. Whilst there, he joined Sir Lindsay Clark on his mission to Pittsburgh for participation in the negotiations for the formation of Alcoa Australia. Returning to Kalgoorlie as general manager to organise the first post-war iron ore exports to Japan out of the port of Geraldton, and subsequently the nickel mine development at Kambalda. In 1967, he and family, now expanded, with the birth of Peter and Martin, returned to Melbourne, was appointed general manager of the company in 1968, managing director in November 71, following the retirement of William Morgan, and then became chairman and managing director in 74 on the retirement of Sir Lindsay Clark. He became executive chairman through until 1990 and retired as chairman in 1999. Arvi's career within WMC was extraordinary. The company's status changed from being the poor relation of the mining companies resident in 360 Collins Street to eclipse all of them. It took every advantage of the great mining boom of the 1960s and 1970s, so well explained in Professor Blaney's book, The Rush That Never Ended. The boom, however, was followed by a steady decline in real commodity prices from the top in 1972 until 3 decades later, when the impact of China exerted a similar impact upon the then larger Australian economy. There were a few flashes of momentary upticks in fortunes, but Arvi had to oversee a company, along with those in the industry, not enjoying the favourable fortunes of the 1960s, but rather a real price decline for their product. The gloss was off the mining industry for almost 3 decades. But this was not the case for Alcoa of Australia. Following the agreement to form the jointly owned company with Alcoa and the Collins House group of mining companies, its competitive position in the international trade in alumina, which it initiated, grew rapidly, along with the original commitments to the Anglesey smelter and the subsequent Portland smelter construction. It's not as if we avoided issues in the marketplace with political tensions and at times between the two entities, Alcoa and WMC, as WMC bought out the other Australian equity participants, whereas we sought to unscramble agreements long in place but aging in their appropriateness. Arvi was chairman of Alcoa of Australia from 1978 to 1996, and the parent board from 1984 to 98, bringing together the proud traditions of Alcoa to an agreeable working relationship with the very modest gold mining company WMC was a testing period in the early years of that relationship. Having been on the board of Alcoa myself from 1977 to 1998, and previously an alternative director beforehand, I can attest to the personal skills Arvi brought to bear, assisting a stunning performance for this group, largely through ensuring all parties focused on the best project outcomes. There are hundreds of those who have worked with Arvi who find they are unable to be present today to participate in celebrating the life of someone who has been so important to them personally in their working and social lives. I've had many emails requesting copies of today's events and lodging their apologies. And I quote one. The following is from Charles Rees, and I quote, "I was in the company only a few weeks when Sir Arvi heard I was new to the mining industry and thought I might benefit from learning a few mining terms. So with that, he photographed some pages out of a mining glossary and attached a small handwritten note to be delivered to my office. The note reads, 'Charles, thought the enclosed glossary of mining terms might come in handy. It is from Sir Lindsay Clark's book, Built on Gold, signed Arvi.' His lens viewed the world differently when it came to people. He still remembered what it was like to be the smallest voice, but he understood the power of a leader to influence through inclusiveness." From Charles Rees. Arvi was greatly liked across so many of the areas in which he became engaged. It's difficult to single out those with whom he had a special relationship. It was mostly the opposite. Those who knew him all felt they had a special relationship, and quite understandably so. From my own observation and from within the company, with which he so closely identified, I would note the respect and closeness of Keith Parry, WMC's Director of Operations, who dedicated himself in a tireless manner to see the building of the great Australian entities primarily in Western Australia and at Olympic Dam. Don Morley, our Director of Finance, seeking to control the finances of an adventuresome mining company. And then his personal assistants who are with us today, Jane Chidgey, Margaret Collins, and Barbara Giles. In the head office, his relationship with Gilbert Ralph and John Reynolds initiated a lifetime of friendship. How much as we observed and respect Arvi's inclusiveness, however, as mentioned by Charles Rates, there were exceptions. In the late 1990s, I had reason to travel to Norilsk, the world's largest nickel mine in the most northern isolated part of Siberia. I asked Arvi to come with Elizabeth and myself. He was emphatic in his refusal to have anything to do with the Russians. He advised to me then, and I shall not forget what it was. Hugh, he said, when the Russian extends his hand, you hit him in the face. And when he gets up, you tell him, now we understand the rules. So traveling with us was Wojciech Ozga, who's also with us today and a mine manager, and fluent, importantly, in Russian. We met with the Norilsk manager, a massive man, no neck, a voice that came from somewhere down near his navel. Alongside him were two lesser heavies, each looking as if they spent most of the day on steroids and gym workouts. His opening words were, "Welcome to Norilsk, Mr. Morgan. All my managers are at least 100 kilos." I wasn't quite sure what to make of this, but quickly came to the conclusion it was prudent not to take Arvi's advice. I think it was the only time I ever failed to take Arvi's advice. Norilsk, of course, is the site of the shameful gulag of the 1930s, where thousands upon thousands of Estonians were located to build this most massive industrial enterprise in conditions unimaginable hardship. When we visited, the ambient temperature was minus 42 degrees centigrade, and the internal temperature for a city of over 400,000 was controlled at only 8 degrees. The building of this nickel-producing giant was upon the lives of so many of Arvi's colleagues and forefathers. The attachment to his country of birth remained strong. In many ways, I'm sure the oppression from which he fled and the freedom he discovered in Australia only increased the comparative worlds of the two centres which he came and the world into which he lived. He was generous with his time and energy to address these tensions and history to the many requests for speaking engagements. When asked, he was prepared to present fascinating histories of his homeland. The title of some of his speeches are revealing: Perestroika in Estonia, Westernizing the East, Estonia past and present, Darkness to Sunrise, being a selection of the many interesting accounts he gave leading back either explicitly or by implication to the Parbo family and the nation of his birth. Arvi arrived in Australia in 1949. His well-ordered mind, clear of clutter and with an engineering-like appreciation of logic, approaching a seasoned outcome, added to his keen interest in English, plain English, not as a language to play with subtleties, but as a wonderful language of communication. And so there became almost a perfect fit between his prose and the man we've all come to admire. As was noted in mid-1984 in the Business Review Weekly, I quote, "What is unusual about Arvi Parbo is the simple and direct way he delivers his message. Western mining executives and some of the bodies on which he serves say when they send draft communications to Arvi Parbo, he has the knack of halving its length and doubling its clarity. More importantly, he also has a diplomatic way of putting things which tend to endear him to people." It's a quirk of timing that we celebrate the contribution of two wonderful Australians in Prime Minister Bob Hawke and Arvi. at and their respective roles in establishing the Business Council of Australia. In the late 1970s and early in the next decade, distemper in the manner in which Australia should position itself in the industrial world and in business representation found itself beset by a conglomeration of business entities illustrating not just a lack of cohesion, but one representing diametrically opposed positions between protection on the one hand and a more open economy on the other. The AIDA, the ACMA, the ACED, the CIA, and the CAI, the CEF, etc., all being subject to an attempt to create some rational outlook for the future assisted by CEDA, acting to a proposed new organisation modelled on the US Business Roundtable. And included in their number was Sir Roderick Carnegie and John Ralph, both here today, and I was present as Arvi's alternate. It was, as Arvi later recalled, like corralling stallions. At an AICD meeting searching for some common ground, Arvi was reported in The Age as saying, and I quote, "Sir Arvi Parbo, chairman of Western Mining, the big nickel developer, recently warned against complacency in Australia, a country lucky enough to become a net energy exporter in the years ahead. We had to compete to sell our resources," he told the annual general meeting of the Australian Industries Development Association. "Our customers are not forced to continue buying from us." So Arvi said he hoped we could free ourselves from the dreadful mentality of the 70s, that we stopped thinking we could do only what is pleasant and agreeable. He attacked those who tried to prevent mining. Numerous anti-everything groups spring up to oppose most developments on unimaginable grounds. I would have to observe how much or how little has changed. But to carry on with the story, it came to pass Bob Hawke won the election in April, and in April 1983, he held an economic summit. Bob Hawke identified in Arvi someone to trust, and it was clear a personal respect was immediately established between them. The new Prime Minister, anxious to deal with a unified business enterprise, gave encouragement to the direction business had been heading, and so it was only a few weeks later that the embryonic Business Roundtable became the basis for the Business Council of Australia. Jim Kirk, the chairman of the Business Roundtable, and Milton Bridgeland, president of the AIDC, jointly announced the newly formed BCA, its initial members including Sir Roderick Carnegie and Brian Loughton, and Arvi as its chairman and Jeff Allen as its chief executive officer. Although Arvi has been recognised for his leadership in the mining sector, it was not until the events of 1983 he became acknowledged as a leader throughout the business community, a leadership he did not seek, but eventuated from the request made by others, including the then Prime Minister. Arvi became increasingly engaged with external boards from the early 80s. Many are household names, from Alcoa, Munich Reinsurance, Zurich Reinsurance, Hearst Australia, Chase AMP Bank, Sara Lee Corporation, to Gusa AG, PA Consulting, CITIC Advisory Board, and so forth. Of most significance was his appointment to the BHP board in 1987, and chairman from May 1989 till May 1992. BHP has arguably been Australia's greatest success for its contribution to the mining and industrial development of Australia, and as such is without peer. We acknowledge Brian Loughton, Jerry Ellis and Don Argus as three past chairmen of BHP being present with us this morning. In the order of this service, you will note a number of awards held by Arvi are listed. That list is a condensation, is condensed from a very long one. There are so many awards it would take some pages to provide the necessary space to record them. However, you will note that there are three sections. The first section is his Australian honours. the second from those of the 3 foreign countries, and the last group from the mining industry, of which he was so proud to owe his livelihood. Arvi's working attachment was with his colleagues at WMC. At his retirement dinner, he noted, "I have been truly privileged to spend my working life with Western Mining. I've always enjoyed whatever I have been doing and the opportunity to work with people I respect and admire, true professionals in whatever their function in the company. I cannot remember a day when I was not looking forward to going to work. I appreciate the comradeship, the high ethical standards which have been made me proud to be part of Western Mining. These standards were set by Sir Lindsay and have been maintained since then." I take this opportunity to acknowledge the Western Mining personnel who have enabled the commemoration to take place and the assistance BHP has offered were it necessary. I also appreciate the long-serving directors with Western Mining, Adrian Clark and Andrew Michelmore, being present. If Bob Hawke is the godfather of the BCA, or proposes to be, it's more so that in the case of Arvi, having had consultation with Gavin Collery, was advised on the structure of the Melbourne Mining Club. And so it was in 2001 it was formed. He was the patron and oversaw every aspect of the design of its structure. No constitution, no articles. Yet it pays a dividend devoted to the mining education programs. He attended almost all of the plus 100 meetings of the Melbourne Mining Club. I want to thank John Howard for his presence and presentation. Early in Arvi's emerging public presence, he recognised a person of special qualities and leadership. He's never wavered his enthusiasm and encouragement and appreciation of Arvi. To Kira and Rory McNeish, we thank you for bringing the special perspectives that come from within a loving family. And to Professor Blaney, our thanks and observations from a long-time friend. And lastly, to Sima and family, to you, Sima, we are indebted to the partnership and comfort you've provided Arvi with travels to remote locations with young children in what was a new and unfamiliar land. Your support of Arvi is something we all admire and give thanks from the bottom of our hearts. Your 66 years of marriage to Arvi is a blessing in which we have all shared. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Ladies and gentlemen, this is now a time for reflection, for a visual insight, a visual tribute into some of the many aspects of the life that was Arvi Hilar Parbo. It is set to music from our organist, Jennifer Chu. Thank you, Jennifer. Of course, the last photograph we have was in this very spot at this very lectern, and how often Sir Arvi was here. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our memorial commemoration to Sir Arvi, and we will replay the visuals over a cup of tea or coffee and a snack. And with the permission of the Parbo family, we have recorded the commemoration, and the audio file and probably the video file will be available on the Melbourne Mining Club website in coming days. As we arise, ladies and gentlemen, and head back to the back of the room, you are accompanied by the sounds of Estonia in Revolution. The name of the track is listed in your order of service, but in essence, it talks of never forgetting the homeland, the pains and the joys. It talks of sacrifice and of a wish upon sacrifice, which includes loss of life as we know it, to return to the soil of your homeland where Estonian wildflowers will blanket your grave. In a celebration of a life well lived, Vale Arvi Parbo. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.